Thank you. Welcome, and it is wonderful to see such a terrific turnout here. A huge thank you to the NourFoundation and the New York Academy of Sciences for making this event possible. I have to say it is a great pleasure to be here because we have a terrific panel and we have some fascinating ideas to dig into. And I know this because I have been neck deep in questions about consciousness for the last 4 to 5 months. As Richard mentioned, I'm in the process of putting the finishing touches on a big 6-hour radio series on the science of consciousness, which will be coming to a public radio station near you in the coming months. Now, I'm not a scientist or a philosopher. I'm a public radio guy. But for whatever reason, I can't stop thinking about this subject, which I have to say is rather odd. So at night, I look over at my wife, Anne, who is reading some great novel. And here I am plowing through some philosophical tome about the mind-brain problem. And I can't really explain it, but it is strangely addictive, for me at least, to read books about the nature of consciousness. And let me give you 2 recent examples. The neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who did groundbreaking work with Francis Crick, recently came out with a very interesting book called Consciousness: Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. So I interviewed him and mentioned that some scholars, including the distinguished philosopher on our panel, David Chalmers, have suggested that science will never understand certain dimensions of consciousness. Koch replied, and I quote, "If you look at the historical record of philosophers, it's pretty disastrous. Science has a spectacular record of understanding the universe," and he went on to say, "I'm profoundly skeptical when philosophers tell us once again what we'll never know." End of quote. Something to talk about this evening, I think. Now, to take another example, the philosopher Thomas Nagel has a new book called Mind and Cosmos, hot off the press, also quite interesting. Nagel's the guy who wrote the famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? The answer, by the way, is we will never know. Nagel's new book is a critique of the standard materialist model of science, and specifically how many neuroscientists try to explain consciousness through neural correlates. He ends the book by saying, and I quote, "I would be willing to bet that the present right-thinking consensus will come to seem laughable in a generation or 2. So here we have fundamental questions about science and philosophy, not to mention a certain degree of testiness when it comes to trying to explain the nature of consciousness. Of course, there are all sorts of other big questions as well. For instance, what kind of consciousness do animals have? Will computers become conscious someday? And what about the people who've fallen into comas after suffering severe brain trauma? Where does consciousness begin and end with them? This is fascinating stuff. We'll be talking about all of this and more on our panel, The Thinking Ape, the Enigma of Human Consciousness. So let me introduce our very distinguished panel of speakers. On the far end over there, David Chalmers is a philosopher of mind and consciousness at New York University and director of the Center for Consciousness at Australia National University. His many books include The Conscious Mind in Search of a Fundamental Theory. And then moving down the row here, Laurie Santos is a professor of psychology at Yale University, investigating the evolution of the mind, theory of mind, and the development of cognition in humans and non-human primates. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel laureate and professor emeritus of psychology at Princeton University, who pioneered behavioral economic theory. He's the author of Thinking, Fast and Slow. And Nicholas Schiff is a physician and scientist at Weill Cornell Medical College, where he focuses on the pathophysiology of impaired consciousness, arousal regulation, and the effects of deep brain stimulation techniques on minimally conscious patients. It is great to have all of you here. Now, just a quick word about what we're going to do this evening. We will talk for roughly an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions, and we'll be off and running there. Dave Chalmers, let me start with you since I mentioned you earlier. Some people say understanding consciousness is the biggest mystery left in science. What do you think?
I've always seen it as pretty well the biggest challenge for science, for a scientific worldview. I mean, I started out in the sciences, in mathematics and physics, and there are a lot of puzzles in these areas, but somehow working in the middle of these areas, kind of got the sense that we've basically got the worldview straight, and we're cleaning up some puzzles, not quite around the edges, but we've got a sense of what the relevant picture of the universe, of what the domain looks like. And there's this beautiful scientific picture of the great chain of explanation. Physics explains chemistry, and chemistry explains biology, and biology at least explains aspects of psychology, which explains aspects of sociology, and so on. And although there's a whole lot there that we haven't worked out, we've at least got somehow a sense of the picture and how pieces fit together. And what's interesting about consciousness is it just doesn't seem to fit easily into that picture at all. Because this is a picture of the world in terms of objective mechanisms described from the objective point of view. And consciousness is the quintessentially subjective phenomenon. It's how things feel from the inside. It's how we experience the world from a subjective point of view. And nothing in this objective picture of the world seems on the face of it to tell you why there's going to be subjectivity. So I see it. By the way, I never said the thing that you said I said.
No.
Christoph, I never said science can't explain consciousness, but I do think maybe
you have hinted at that very strongly.
Certain kinds of standard scientific explanation, wholly, for example, in terms of brain mechanisms, I think may fail. But I see it more thoroughly as a challenge to science, and it may be that our methods of science and our theories of science have to be expanded to bring consciousness in. For years, I've organized a conference called Toward a Science of Consciousness. So I'm pro-science. I'm a glass half full guy.
I never said you were not pro-science. Well, we will come back to that, how far science can go. Well, let me just throw this open to the rest of you. Is consciousness one of the big questions out there? Is it one of the big mysteries, or have we overblown this? Is it not as big a challenge as we're saying? Nicholas Schiff, let me turn to you.
I would totally agree. I mean, I would say that the science of consciousness is extremely challenging, and in the context of trying to make operational evaluations of patients, when the question is, are they conscious or not, is something where we don't have a standard model. I don't even think there's a dogma that would be laughable. So we do have measurements, and we have operational approaches to it, and we certainly know when somebody's conscious the way we know casually when somebody's conscious. But when you have somebody who is in a coma and starts to recover, but they inconsistently respond, it may be very difficult to know when they're not responding, are they conscious? Are they not conscious? If they never respond, could they become conscious? Are they conscious now and we just don't realize it? And we're getting better at measurement tools that approximate, not answers, but probabilities of, well, we should worry about this more. And actually, I would say that as I've looked at this, and my colleagues have looked at this more carefully with better measurements over the last 10 years, this is more challenging and harder. I mean, I realize how many mistakes I've made, and I still make them. And so I find it very challenging, a very humbling kind of problem to even try to attempt to solve.
Laurie Santos, let me turn to you. I know your specialty is more animal cognition, but is this a big question for you? What is consciousness?
No, I think I agree with what folks have said so far. I don't even think as modern neuroscientists and cognitive scientists we know how to get at the question of the subjective experience, when you're having it, what it feels like to have it, how to measure it. That said, we know cognitive science has made tremendous inroads into other things that we thought we weren't going to be able to measure, right? So if we were having this panel back in the 1950s, there'd be a bunch of behaviorists sitting up here who would tell you we can measure behavior fantastically well, but when we look at the black box of the mind, it's just going to remain a black box. And fascinatingly, we've come up with all kinds of cool techniques to probe what's going on in the black box, both behavioral ones and neuroscientific ones. And so I guess I didn't think you would be the optimist up here about measuring consciousness, but I'll sort of be a glass half full approach that I think we definitely don't even know where to search yet, but that doesn't mean 50 years from now we won't all be in this room saying, oh, we have this fantastic tool and we know what we're doing.
Daniel Kahneman, how big a question is this in science, consciousness?
Well, that's very odd. I mean, I'm in a minority because for some reason I'm one of those people who never got myself completely fascinated by this question. and it's in part, I think, because I never could imagine what an answer to that question would be. Mm-hmm. So I find it difficult to conceive of a question without having some idea of the structure of what an acceptable answer would be. And that, if there is one, I don't know about it. What I do see, and that's the approach that you talked about, in fact, we can identify consciousness. We can agree on it. It is subjective, but we can evaluate the consciousness of other people and of other animals. And we're getting better at it, and we're getting more consistent at it. And building from the bottom up, I think we can get an understanding of, a better understanding, or at least a better description of the conditions for consciousness. To sort of bridge the gap between the material and the subjective, I don't know how that gap could be bridged. I don't know what the meaning of the question is, and if that is the objective that we have, I don't see how we can succeed.
Is neuroscience the most important discipline in trying to understand consciousness?
Well,
I think we have no idea. But
Yeah, I think it's about how you define neuroscience.
Right.
And neuroscience is a very broad topic. Most of the people I know who I work closely with who are neuroscientists, some of them are physicists, some of them are engineers, some of them are cross-trained in lots of other things. So, if the simple answer is yes. If a science of the brain, if we believe that consciousness is a brain process, which I see consciousness as a brain process, will be centered around neuroscience. But neuroscience per se is a large kind of set of activities.
But let's come back to this question of subjective experience. I mean, neuroscience can map lots of things that are happening in the brain, and these parts of the brain have to fire for this particular mental state to happen. But is that really getting at what subjective experience is about?
Maybe the question isn't, is neuroscience the most important thing, but is neuroscience all you need to explain consciousness? And I think, for all the reasons that Danny and others have been saying, it looks like neuroscience alone isn't going to tell you why there is subjectivity, because there's this potentially unbridgeable gap. So my view has always been you've got to gather the data from neuroscience, which will be a huge part of the story, but also gather what we might think of as subjective data about consciousness, measured either from the first-person point of view or from the sympathetic third-person point of view, as when we talk to people and ask them what they're conscious of, and build it into kind of a multi-level picture that takes seriously the neuroscience, but also takes seriously the deliverances of subjective experience.
I want to say a word in sort of for my discipline. It's not only in neuroscience. I mean, there is real experimental psychology, I think, has a lot to say about this. And in fact, some of the more interesting data are coming from there, because they're raising the question, if we accept a sort of naive and obvious definition of what consciousness is, there is an enormous amount of mental activity that goes on outside consciousness. And I think there are discoveries being made there that, for some people in my field, raise the question of, they don't know what consciousness is for, because they never can find anything that cannot be done without it. And I think that this is actually happening. So we have the feeling that consciousness is very important for sort of deeper mental activity, for more orderly mental activity, for rule following. But there does seem to be an awful lot of extremely sophisticated stuff that can be produced without it.
That's what makes the measurements very difficult.
That's right.
Well, I want to come back to this question about subjective experience. And I mean, yes, we can ask people what they're thinking, what they're feeling. We could, hook them up to an fMRI and ask them some of these questions and monitor what's going on in the brain. But still, to try to understand the essence of what they're feeling, can science really go there? I mean, other than asking what the person is thinking about? I mean, is that science?
Let's distinguish between gathering data about what they're conscious of and explaining the data. I think I can find out what you're conscious of by asking you. I mean, this does raise philosophical questions. How can I be sure that you're conscious? Maybe you're a complete zombie, and so on. But it seems reasonable under natural assumptions, at least, to take what you're saying as a guide to your consciousness, and thereby I can find out about other people's consciousness. But it's another thing to explain it. What we're getting right now, actually, there has been a very big neuroscience of consciousness developing, especially over the last 20 years. It's gone amazing places. But right now, it is a science of correlation. You correlate certain neural processes with certain kinds of consciousness. People draw the diagram of the visual system, and it looks like, okay, these bits seem to connect more closely to the kinds of conscious states that people report, and so on, than other bits do. But it's still a science of correlation. What we're lacking is explanation. Why is it that all these processes in the brain should give rise?
And we have no idea what it would look like if we met it.
Can we ever get that? Can we ever get an explanation for why these subjective experiences come up?
I would guess the answer is yes, but that doesn't mean that that gets us any closer to it.
You know, I want to raise a difficulty because one thing that troubles me is that something is going to be happening from robotics. So we're going to have robots with facial expressions, expressing emotions. And we're going to be responding emotionally to those. And then they're going to talk, and their voices are going to express emotion, and they're going to make sense. And they will look conscious to us. I have no doubt that this is something that is going to happen before we understand consciousness. We will have robots that will appear conscious to us.
Will appear. Does that mean they
Look,
are?
I mean, I don't know if they are or not. I mean, how do you know? And is there any better criterion than it's a judgment that we make about the other person? You know, I know my own subjectivity. I believe you're conscious, but my belief about your consciousness, I think, could really be simulated by my belief in a robot's consciousness. And that, you know, where that goes, you know, I have no idea.
So let me ask you, or maybe David, a question. Do you think
David,
that robot could use natural language? And when are we going to have a robot that can adequately use natural language? And I think that's the harder problem, right?
Well, that's a hard problem. But I'd say I'll be convinced that the robot is conscious when that robot says to me, "Boy, you know, I know deep down that I'm a set of silicon circuits, but I just can't explain this experience I'm having of subjectivity."
I don't think you can define consciousness by being a philosopher.
Yeah. I didn't say this was a necessary condition, just sufficient.
Well, so let's just pursue this question of computer consciousness, because certainly a lot of people speculate on that. Does a computer have to, does the makeup of a computer have to mimic the human brain in some way? Or can it be an entirely different? I mean, what does it take for a computer to start to develop what would seem to be consciousness?
I mean, we have no idea. For a computer to trip our tripwire of thinking that they're
That's
conscious,
it.
all they have to do. I mean, Siri on my iPhone sometimes gets you like, "Oh, you knew there was a Rite Aid right there." It's like, how did you do that without conscious subjective experience?
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, but there's a different question about whether or not the actual gears are producing something like a subjective state in this robot. And I think, you know, as Danny said,
I'm really not sure that we can tell. I mean, that third person thing is overwhelming.
How do you feel about other people?
Oh, I'm quite sure that everybody in this room is conscious.
Why so sure?
But if there was, you know, really convincing robots sitting in this audience, I would not be able to say, "Oh, that one is not conscious." You know, it would look. The evidence that I have of the consciousness of other people can be faked.
But this is
Or can be produced. Not faked, it can be produced. And, you know, when we say they won't speak natural language, I had a teacher in philosophy many years ago, Professor Bar-Hillel, and he was asked sometime in the 1950s about when computers would understand language. And he said, "Oh, never." And by never, I mean the next 15 years. So we really don't know what never means in this context.
Did you want to follow up?
Well, you know, I just think that part of the problem is our best evidence for consciousness in anyone else is our own subjective experience. And in essence, it's transferring the problem to how little we can get out of external observation about intuitions about the process and what it could be. And for my work, you know, it is very bottom up, as you say. And the questions that we're dealing with often are, okay, could this system recover consciousness? So they become immediately mechanistic, and they are immediately in the context of the human brain. And they're very challenging. And they really do require that we think about, well, you know, what state can produce consciousness? And we're getting much better, I think, even with causal efforts to get to the state question. But the issue of subjectivity and how that happens mechanistically, I think, is opaque, as you say.
Laurie, I want to pursue this in terms of animal consciousness. You study cognition in primates in particular. What kind of comparisons can we make between human consciousness and non-human primate consciousness?
I mean, it's a big, difficult issue, especially when you mean about their subjective experience. I can't hang out with them without thinking they have a subjective experience. I mean, any of you guys out there who have a pet, I bet you implicitly assume that that dog has a deep and rich subjective experience, right? But we just wouldn't know. It's still a puzzle to ignore the subjective experience question and ask, what are they thinking? Which I think we have better measures to gain some traction on. But it's a real puzzle, and I think the more we get to know about animals and the more fascinating things they do, they're not using natural language, but they're making incredibly complicated decisions, incredibly complicated evaluations. They have preferences. They have all the kind of behavioral signatures that we associate with a creature that's having subjective experience. But again, that's my tripwire, which is going to get tripped up by really good CGI 2D image on a screen. Right?
My sense is slightly different. I think that emotion is very important in our attribution of consciousness to other people, and to animals. Computers can compute very complicated things, and that we don't think that's it. It is really the emotional connection that gives us this intuition. So it's an interesting psychological question. What makes us feel that something is conscious besides ourselves? And, that has a psychology to it. Whether that psychology can sustain a science, I'm very skeptical about. And the example of the computer is, the robot fooling me by looking emotional, or maybe not fooling me if it is emotional. That's why I never got quite caught up in that issue.
It's one of the classic philosophical problems. People call it the problem of other minds. How do you know that anybody has a mind? How do you know who or what has a mind? And what we're finding is that this problem is just cropping up practically in some ways within the science of consciousness all the time. How do we know that animals are conscious? How do we know that eventually the problem will come up about computers? And in Nico's work, how do we know that people coming out of coma and so on, vegetative states and so on, how can we diagnose the presence of consciousness in these people? And what we find is people are very imaginative and creative, and they find, and there are techniques which people are developing that don't solve the philosophical problem, but we find criteria for consciousness that seem to fit with our normal practices of ascribing consciousness to people in everyday life and elsewhere. I mean, there is a beginning to be a field of we might call it the psychology of other minds, which Danny is alluding to here, just finding the criteria that ordinary people use for ascribing consciousness. Do an experiment and say, here's a robot, here's a baby, here's this, here's that, show them a movie, and say, is that one conscious? Is that one thinking? Turns out you get different answers, actually. Consciousness seems to go with, with things like, pain and
with emotion
and so on. And thinking seems to go much more with the sophisticated stuff.
Yeah. So if
these two things come apart.
You should really tell us some of the things that you're doing that are so strange and about.
Okay.
Tell us.
I have to parse that a little bit.
No, I meant fascinating.
In relation to what David just said, I think, right? Is that so? I think this point about is somebody conscious can come up in ways that just are unimaginable until you're actually faced with certain patients at the bedside, and this comes up in almost all of our work, but there are some cases that I still go home every night and I think about and I worry a lot about, because we know that some people can be locked in. Anybody who's seen The Diving Bell and the Butterfly has encountered an example of this. Somebody's fully conscious, they've lost their motor function, and they come out.
So from the outside perspective, they seem totally without consciousness.
No, if you're a good examiner, you can figure out they're conscious right away. It's no problem. This isn't the problem. Okay. I'm setting it up. And
how do you know?
What?
How do you know? Right
Because
away?
you have a reliable communication channel. Okay, so this is like a sort of a bar, right? And so there's it's probably worth kind of saying operationally when we're looking at patients. So there's coma and vegetative state, and at least by definition, when a neurologist looks at a patient and identifies them as in coma or vegetative, it means the same thing from a behavioral point of view, in that there's no evidence that they're responding to the world, there's no evidence that they're taking in sensory information and are aware of it, and the difference between coma and vegetative state is a technical one that has to do with the arousal systems in the brainstem returning a patterning of an eyes open, eyes closed change in the eye opening and eye closure. This is not related to sleep and wake. It's not associated with the kind of electrical activity you see in sleep. And it's just a part of the sort of the typical recovery pattern after coma, with, you know, some fine print for the neurologist in the audience that there are occasionally eyes open comas and they're associated with particular kind of injury. But at the very border of vegetative state, the next level of recovery, which is now being called minimally conscious state, you start to see sort of unambiguous signs of some response to the environment. And in the sort of gray zone between these two conditions are things that are just tracking of a visual image, or their eyes look over to a sound. And although those don't seem very different than just opening your eyes and closing them, it turns out that they're increasingly recognize that even those small signs can make huge differences in prognosis in patients. And this is something that's not being dealt with very well, because there's nowhere to put people like this early on, and they can go on for weeks to recover. And you know, some of them might recover so that they're ambulating and walking around in a year and not get adequate therapy. So, you know, this is sort of like a major issue. But as you move on and people start to recover more function, they might start to respond to a command. And then that becomes very obvious that somebody is, you know, lift up, give me a thumbs up. Okay, you know, that's most people can get that. That's like okay. That maybe that's all they can do. Their level of consciousness fits into this minimally conscious state. But you know, that's what the neurologists want to call it. For a lot of people, they're just conscious, and that's it. But operationally, once we can communicate with somebody with a yes or a no that's reliable, you know, lift your thumb up on the right for yes, lift your thumb up on the left for no, and do this every time we come to the bedside, then that's transferring out.
But there are these locked-in patients who, as in the diving bell and the butterfly, who only have control over their eye blinking.
Right, eye blinking or eye movement or head movement.
The question that always obsesses me about these patients is, how do we know there aren't locked-in patients who are just like that, except they don't have control over the eye blinking?
So you anticipate why I was setting all this up for the audience. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So two examples. One example is a published case, if anybody wants to read about it. It was a patient who was locked in classically with a brainstem injury, who my colleagues and I saw, who had an unusual extension of the injury into the auditory system. The auditory system is usually very well preserved because it's bilateral, it goes to both sides of the brain. But this person ended up with a central auditory agnosia. And what that means is they could hear, but they couldn't really put together complex sounds. And as a result, although it was unrecognized for many months, they relied primarily on lip reading. But anytime somebody would come and try to test their cognitive level, they would get to a point where this person just seemed like they fell off the curve, and they were judged to be minimally conscious or cognitively impaired. And it wasn't until my colleague, Joe Giacino, finally figured out to draw and write the questions that it became clear that the person was fully conscious. Okay? And just needed to have the visual representation of the words. Okay, so but in that case, they're locked in, they're fine. But the kind of cases that we're dealing with now that I think are really most troubling are patients who, at times, are just like a locked-in patient. Look down for yes, look to the side for no, accurate communication for 2 hours a day. They can try to work with a BCI, but they're not good enough to get one, or they're not good enough to use one reliably. And then this challenges, it gives an urgency to the whole problem, because now you have an urgency to treat, because you want this person to come out, and you need to understand what are the problems they're having. Is it that they're not able to control their motor function, or is their conscious state having a problem? And how do we make those measurements? And that's kind of like, you know, that's one example. There are many.
It is so fascinating. I want to come back. I want to pick up the thread that we were talking about earlier about animal consciousness, because there are all kinds of fascinating questions here. I get one. I mean, the question that so many of us ask is, so what is it that makes us human? What is it about human consciousness that sets us apart from the rest of the animal world? Is it something fundamentally different about us, or is it just a matter of degree? Are chimpanzees basically like us, but sort of at a lesser level? Laurie, what's your sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of subjective experience, mostly just because we don't have great ways to measure. In terms of cognition, in terms of how they think, we're starting to get, I think, some important hints about what makes us different. Any of you, I bet if I did a sort of show of hands of what you might think makes us unique, I bet language would come up as like a big answer. And I think language helps, because if you don't have language, as you said, without natural language, it's hard to sort of express yourself and so on. But my guess is that language is actually a red herring. I'm kind of in the minority of animal researchers thinking this stuff. I just think if pigeons had language, they just wouldn't really have anything interesting to say anyway, because they don't really have the thinking behind it to get language off the ground. And so lately, folks have started to think that really one of the things that makes us human is the kind of thing that we're doing right now, which is not the fact that we're communicating with natural language, but that we're motivated to actually share what we're thinking at all. That's the power that language does in its expression, but it's built on a motivation that's not the words that we use in the natural language we have. It's built on this motivation to actually share. And we're getting new hints that it seems like other animals, particularly even our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, they don't seem to have the same kind of motivation to share what they know about the world. And that predicts some big differences, right? It means they're not going to communicate in the same way as us. They're not going to innovate and sort of share what they know. So that's kind of what folks have been thinking lately.
Let me mention something that Jane Goodall once told me when I interviewed her one time. She said that she's fascinated by the whole idea of thinking without words, thinking without language. And she said that if she could spend just a few minutes inside the mind of a chimpanzee, she would learn more about what a chimpanzee is than all the decades of research that she's done. Does that resonate with you?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, if I could take some sort of, I don't know, it's not a time machine, but a sort of mind machine and sort of dive in, it would be fantastically interesting. I wouldn't pick a chimpanzee. I'd pick, something way crazier than that. Take an ant. I mean, people always jump to insects when they're trying to pick something that isn't conscious. But the fact is, if you actually look at insect behavior, sometimes insects are doing some fantastically complicated things that mimic what humans do in really rich ways. My favorite example is from E.O. Wilson, who talks about an ant's reaction to death. So if you live in an ant colony, one of the things you have to deal with is debris and death around you. And it turns out that if you put a dead ant inside an ant colony, the ants will take the ant out, identify it, take it out to an area of refuse, and lay it in what folks call an ant cemetery. And this led all these animal cognition folks to say, wow, maybe ants have a concept of death. What are they using to decide this other ant isn't conscious and all this stuff? Turns out the ant problem is actually pretty easy. It's a small chemical called oleic acid that the ant emits from its exoskeleton when it dies. And if you put that chemical on living ants that are running around, other ants in the colony will grab them and throw him in the ant cemetery. So, hopefully that's not the mistake we're making with our own behavioral measures.
Let me follow up on that then. I mean, I'm going to ask you all to speculate on this. How far down the animal chain do you think consciousness goes?
Across.
Across. Okay, sorry.
Animal people, we go across. Yeah, I mean, I was raised as a college student with the late Don Griffin, who is a scholar of animal consciousness, and he made the claim is that we don't know anything different about the organic matter that makes up non-human brains, and nothing that makes it different than human brains, and therefore, under his view, the most parsimonious explanation is it goes to all other organic creatures that we call life. So, that's one view.
In the absence of a criterion, and in some cases, I mean, the ant story that you tell is very interesting because it ties up with what we were talking earlier about emotional responses. Here is something that looks like an emotional response, and our intuition is, oh, that's, we can empathize with that ant. And then it turns out, oh, if it's a reaction to a chemical, forget it. I mean, that's not evidence of consciousness. Well, this argument is flawed every possible way.
Yeah.
I mean, we do feel that way, and it ruins our intuition. But maybe what we're responding to is the equivalent of a chemical. It's just, an emotional expression that we can empathize with.
It's very hard to find a place where consciousness gives out as you move across the natural order. I mean, you're always looking for some capacity so that without that, you wouldn't have consciousness, but any such language maybe, or reasoning, or certain kinds of emotion.
Do you need a brain to have consciousness?
Well, this is one of the questions. I mean, is consciousness restricted to we got consensus on the biological on animals, but in fact, you mentioned John Griffin, his brother David Griffin, is a philosopher who's come out in favor of panpsychism, the view that everything has a mind. There's some element of consciousness at the very bottom level of the the natural order, including...
Dave,
I think
haven't you, I just want to follow
Yeah.
up on this.
Yeah.
Haven't you come out with something similar?
have-
we have talked about this.
I
and
have some-
you have suggested that maybe that consciousness cannot be reduced to physics, that in fact consciousness may be a property of nature in itself.
I do think that consciousness maybe... We have things in science, like space and time and mass, that cannot be explained in terms of things... cannot be fully explained in terms of things simpler than themselves. That's not unscientific. That's just something we're used to in physics. We're used to, outside physics, explaining things in terms of things simpler than themselves. But this is a strategy that doesn't seem to work well for consciousness. So I've at least been led to speculate that we should take seriously the idea that consciousness is fundamental. Once you do that, and there's two different steps in the argument. Once you've done that, it's also natural to speculate, and it is just speculation, that consciousness may be present at a very fundamental level of the physical natural order, and that, for example, David Griffin may be correct, and that consciousness is to be found, some element of consciousness is to be found in fundamental particles. I don't know if this is right.
What is that then? If I mean, what is it made of?
Some people prefer to say proto-consciousness, some precursor. The panpsychists tend to say some precursor to and we don't understand it, but we don't understand the nature of matter. We don't understand consciousness. So when it comes to consciousness, we're in the dark, and for a philosopher, we speculate for a living, and we just try to say what kind of picture of the natural order.
Okay, Danny, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil the fun, but earlier I think we were agreeing that what we have are intuitions about consciousness. And when we start and talk about consciousness as a noun, rather than about our intuitions about consciousness, there's virtually no limit to what we could argue, because we actually don't know. Right. All we have are our intuitions about consciousness. So the legitimacy of that question is something that I would like to question.
Right. Well,
that is, if we don't know what it is, if all we have are our intuitions, then ultimately all we can do is study the psychology of these intuitions. Mm-hmm. And that is a very different thing than studying the ontology of consciousness itself.
So we don't know where consciousness is present. We certainly don't know that consciousness is present in these non-biological systems. We also don't know that it's not present. We simply don't have data about it.
But I mean, if we will never know, that is, if the only thing that we have is our intuitions about the presence of consciousness, then I genuinely do not understand the question. I don't understand what we don't know.
I think what we need to do is build a theory of consciousness that explains the data that we know about, which is the human data.
That explains our intuitions?
About animals. That
explains, but this comes back to the question of, can science explain consciousness? I mean, the idea that's on the table here, it seems to me, is maybe there are some dimensions of consciousness that are beyond the explanatory power of science. Well, is that a legitimate hypothesis to entertain?
Well, it's not a very interesting one because it doesn't do any work for us. I mean, I think it's fair to. I would say we should just bracket that possibility and work as if we could discover enough information about how certain things work mechanistically to gain an intuition that's precise about how things that we consider conscious happen in the human brain. The question of where does consciousness start sort of on a phylogenetic spectrum is a hard one because, without a mechanism attached to what we already are trying to solve about when we're conscious or not, it's not a meaningful question to me. I mean, I don't think a jellyfish is conscious, at least in a way that makes any contact or does any work for me to help me understand the problem of assigning consciousness as a possibility mechanistically for a physical system, which is a brain, usually when I'm thinking about it.
But, if it is true that we could be fooled into thinking that a robot is conscious, a fully expressive emotional robot, that really changes the picture entirely. And then all that is left, I think, in the psychology. Because asking the ontological question, is the robot really conscious, I'm really not sure that there is any more that we can do besides the fact that, yes, we think it is. We feel it is.
I was going to say, and I think that the studying and figuring out our intuitions about what is conscious is an important question for two reasons. One is they're fantastically wrong. I mean, I think everything we know about our intuition suggests they're fantastically wrong. However, they govern a lot of our behavior and a lot of our judgments about things, right? I mean, so right now in politics, we have questions about whether corporations should have rights. And I bet our lay intuitions about whether those corporations have subjective experiences probably tell us something about, what we should be doing to them, right? There's a big question about when we leave the reception here, should we be eating things that have meat in it of certain forms, of certain kinds of animals? And I bet our intuitions about whether we should be doing that are governed, in fact, by whether or not these guys have conscious states. So I think understanding what our intuitions are telling us is going to be really important and really meaningful. But they might be wrong.
Dave, I want to come back to you because, do you agree with what the rest of the panel or some of the panelists are saying, that basically some of these questions are not relevant because science has no handle on some of the larger philosophical questions about consciousness?
I mean, I'm not saying that Nico should give up his day job today and go study electron lines. This would be crazy. But I do think that it is a meaningful question whether jellyfish are conscious, whether it goes further. And there is a fact of the matter about it, which maybe we're not in a position to tell right now, maybe not ever. However, I think there's going to be there may be ways eventually to get at this through scientific methods, if indirect ones. Here's what I think we have to do. We have to start with the cases of consciousness we know about, the cases where we have data, roughly the human case. Build a theory, an explanatory theory that connects consciousness there, for example, to brain process. I think of this as trying to abstract away the sort of the fundamental principles that connect brain processes to consciousness. It could turn out that the most successful theory that explains the data we have says that consciousness is generated by certain kinds of complex processes, certain kinds of reasoning, or certain kinds of complex recurrent structures, and so on. Then we'll be in a position to extend these to other cases and say, well, that's the theory that works. Extend it to the other cases.
Right.
Where that structure is not present, we should expect that consciousness is not present. It could turn out, on the other hand, though, that the theory of consciousness that explains it the best turns out to tie consciousness to some basic properties, for example, of information and information processing in the brain. And then what we'll want to do is to extend it to other cases. And it may be speculative because we can't measure consciousness directly in those systems. This theory gives us reason to think that there is some
that might help to explain computer consciousness then. I mean, if consciousness ultimately is about information, a computer might have an integrated information system as the human brain does.
Well, I mean, it could be, and that would lead, I think, to a conflict in intuitions. It could be that your research could isolate an area in the brain that is associated with consciousness, that is active. I'm speculating. And then if we found animals that don't have that area of the brain, we would have some, we would have some reason to say they don't have consciousness. But that would really conflict with the intuitions associated with a robot who certainly doesn't have those areas of the brain and can fool us can lead us into, can generate the same intuitions that it has consciousness. So I don't really see a way out of this.
But the problem with the robot, I think, as an analogy, is that it isn't typically the case that most of the intuitions about consciousness just come from observing other people. They come from this introspective aspect of examining natural language and having subjective, or at least taking the attitude that we have subjective experience and then acting accordingly and sharing it, as you would say. So,
but you could surely program a robot to do all of the above. I mean, there is no.
You could, but if you knew it was a robot, then that might be the only reason why you wouldn't attribute consciousness to it, and it wouldn't be a bad reason today, unless we had a mechanistic account of what consciousness arose from, and we had instantiated that in the robot.
So Danny, how about we take your neurons and replace them one at a time by silicon, which are functionally isomorphic to the original neurons, and replace half your brain, and we'll ask you.
At Berkeley, John, we speculated a lot about whether, it has to be made of meat. And I don't see any reason why it would have to be made of meat. So if you found silicon substitutes I see no reason to, and the functioning would remain the same, and the emotional expressions would remain the same.
That transfers the problem sort of the way David is talking about, because as you say, it could be information or it could be some other aspect of complex matter that the brain is an example of sharing that property that's essential. And once we understand that, certain things will become transparent about how this kind of thing happens.
I do think it's more likely to be the information than the biology, for example.
Right, like plasma physics, like something about condensed matter or some kind of thing that happens with certain kinds of things.
If it is the information, then that doesn't fit with our intuitions, which are driven primarily by emotions. So our attributions of consciousness are driven by emotions. When we think about consciousness, we think about information processing. And there is really a deep disconnect between those two.
But let me ask you about this research project that is now going on, what some people have called the connectome, this extremely ambitious project to map the neural circuitry of the brain. I mean, it's sort of almost beyond comprehension to think about it. I mean, there are nearly 100 billion neurons in the brain, trillions of synapses. Let's just say, theoretically, somewhere down the road, this can be mapped. How close are we to understanding consciousness then?
I know a lot of the people in that project, and so I feel like if I answer, I'm going to be sharing one of their ideas, so maybe I'll attribute it. But one of my colleagues, Partha Mitra, who works out of Cold Spring Harbor, is trying to develop a stitched digital atlas of the detailed connections of the mouse connectome. It's one of the kind of projects in that space. And he points out that many of these cells, their connections are so manifold across the brain. When you actually do one of these studies that they're doing, where you take ultramicrotomes and take the entire brain and trace out every possible place, that's going to require different theoretical models and laws about how systems that have this architecture might even possibly work. So I don't know that we're closer, but that is in the right direction, in my view.
Dave?
It's an absolutely fascinating project. I actually had lunch today with someone who's working on this project, the brain activity map. They're trying to get funding to really get the whole the whole brain for, maybe it'll be a fly, and then maybe a shrew, the tiny little Etruscan shrew, and then maybe 50 years a human brain through the right kind of imaging techniques, if the right ones can be developed. And I do think that once we've got that kind of tool, I mean, neuroscience is obviously going to be revolutionized. Because in neuroscience, we're just at the mercy of our tools, and the tools today have been very limited. A new imaging technique comes along, like fMRI, and suddenly, well, the science transforms, but it's all just arbitrary, what it gives us access to. Having access, for example, to every bit of every neural firing in the brain and every connection is going to suddenly put us in a position where the mechanisms start to be transparent to us. But it's still the mechanisms. It's still the mechanisms. I think what we end up having is probably a situation where we get an extraordinarily sophisticated science of the correlations. Presumably be able to manipulate the brain and simulate certain things and see how one will even be able to do it in principle to oneself. Actually, it was a psychologist, Paul Meehl, wrote an article back in the 1950s called the complete autocerebroscopist. It was exactly this scenario in a thought experiment. You have a picture of your brain there. You are the experimenter. You are in this scanner. You have the complete data about your brain in front of you. You can experiment on your own brain and see how your experience changes. So this, in principle, we have a vast trove of objective data about the brain, vast trove of subjective data about consciousness. You would think then one would at least be able to abstract out the relevant kinds of principles that connect the objective here to the subjective. Now, whether that means we cross the mind-brain gap, I don't think it ever goes away, but we boil it down to the simplest possible principle.
But would that be different? Would that be not be correlational?
I think my own view is the best we can get is correlational, but we can get better and more systematic.
Better correlation.
We can get lots of correlation.
All you have in physics ultimately is some fundamental principles are in a certain sense correlational, the law of gravity. But we get a simple principle that generates the data. I think they say in physics the ultimate goal is a set of laws so simple you can write them on the front of a T-shirt. So, maybe there's a goal for it. If it got to the point where we had laws of consciousness connecting physical processing to consciousness, so simple, you could write them on the front of a T-shirt, maybe that wouldn't remove the mind-brain gap because you've still got the principle. I think we would call that a pretty powerful theory.
Do you need consciousness to have a sense of self?
Well, since we can't fully measure consciousness, it's tricky to ask. But I mean,
And sense of self.
the sense of self is also very difficult. So there's been a long history of work in the field of animal psychology trying to measure a sense of self. And a lot of that history, I think, points to some creativity on the part of researchers, but not great methods ultimately, despite the fact that a lot of creativity was employed. So,
And sort of that working assumption is that if the animal can recognize itself in a mirror, then it has a sense of self.
yeah, and in fact, even until this day, you get researchers testing new animals with new mirrors and new kind of marks on their forehead, trying to see if they recognize themselves. And the pattern seems to be that the standard big creatures who seem smart like us seem to do it pretty well. So you get chimpanzees doing this and elephants doing it, and other critters who are smaller and don't look a lot like us don't seem to do it. But I mean, if you thought of your sense of self and your set of preferences and your future goals or whatever, and I tried to reduce that to, did you notice if you had some splotch on your face when you walked by the bathroom mirror, you might feel that was missing something. And I think that's the general sense in animal cognition right now, is that measure, yeah, it might tell us something about who can recognize themselves in a mirror, but it's not capturing what we really want it to capture. And this is the big puzzle for folks who are in animal cognition, right, is that we have these good ideas of the kinds of things that we do that feel like good things, and capturing those very things in an animal in the absence of natural language is really tricky.
I think it's time to go to the audience here. Now, there are 2 roving mics, and if you have questions, why don't you raise your hand? I will call on you. Please don't talk until you have a mic, because we are recording this. And let us go here. Let's go right over here.
I would very much appreciate each of the panelists giving a definition of consciousness.
Good question.
Yeah.
I think it's very hard to define consciousness in terms of anything more basic than consciousness, just as it's very hard to define time and space in terms of anything more basic than time and space. But there are things we can say which at least I think are helpful. There's a phrase due to Thomas Nagel, who was mentioned earlier, who wrote this article, "What is it like to be a bat?" You might say that a system is conscious when there is something it's like to be that system. So there's something it's like to be me, there's something it's like to be you, and if you're not a panpsychist, you'll say there's nothing it's like to be that cup. So likewise, a mental state, like seeing, will be conscious if there's something it's like to be in that state. So there's something it's like for me to see you right now, but there's nothing it's like for me to maybe do some computation in my cerebellum. So I don't know if that's a definition exactly, but it's at least a way of getting a grip on what I'm talking about when I talk about consciousness.
Nika?
Yeah, so, and credits to William James. I think most neurologists use some variation on William James' definition of consciousness, which is that consciousness is awareness of the self and or the environment. Okay, and most of
you just use the word awareness.
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
right, which is tautological.
Yeah.
As David,
Yeah.
the philosophy professor, quite rightly points out, I got away with that. And James did too, apparently.
I'm not going to, if the philosopher can't give you a definition that will satisfy you, I'm surely not going to be able to do so.
Well, I'm going to question whether there is a satisfactory definition. And because I think all we know is what intuitions we have about what is consciousness. And if that's all we know, then defining consciousness as if it exists independently of our intuitions is an exercise that I have no idea how to conduct. I mean, I know that very intelligent people deal with this and spend their lives doing it, and it is an exercise, frankly, I have never understood. That's the frustration I've been expressing.
Yeah.
Actually, my favorite definition I've heard is consciousness, that annoying time between naps.
Excellent question.
We can go with that.
Yeah.
Let's go over here. Wait for the mic.
I'm interested in the difference between kinds and degrees of consciousness. with the vagaries of evolution and the variations it throws up, why should we think that capabilities are the only thing that vary consciousness, and not like in the examples that were given, gravity and electricity? They're very different fundamentally. They're both forces. Why can't there be different kinds of consciousness in that sense rather than just in terms of capabilities?
Response?
I mean, I think once we get a good metric for subjective experience, once we know how to measure it in us versus other things, I can't help but imagine that we're going to find differences in kind of subjective experience. For example, again, I don't have a great way to measure consciousness in me necessarily. I definitely don't have a good way to measure consciousness in a jellyfish, but I imagine there's something that it feels like for me to feel embarrassed. There's that state that I could experience, that there's no similar thing that it's like for a jellyfish to feel embarrassed, right? And so my guess is we're going to find all kinds of gradations once we actually have a good way to look. But the problem, as we keep coming up with, is that we don't have a great way to look.
Let's go way back there.
Hi. I was wondering about using a scientific method that's based on objectivity to study subjectivity, and whether in fact part of discovering subjectivity in consciousness requires a new scientific method.
Good question. Do we need a new science here?
I think there can be objective facts about subjectivity. I think it's an objective fact that I'm conscious.
Yeah.
It's probably an objective fact that you're conscious. There's the objectivity of finding out. Maybe I can't know for sure that you're conscious. But, we're faced with this problem in science all the time. Can I know for sure that the external world exists? We have to make certain assumptions to get that off the ground. For example, perception is some kind of guide to reality. We're not all, in the matrix.
But do we need a new scientific framework? Do we need a new scientific paradigm here to crack the consciousness problem?
I think we have to do at least this much. We have to take the data. We have to take subjective first-person data seriously, because that is the data we have. Why do we believe we're conscious? Because we've experienced it. And there have been moments in the history of science when this stuff has just been taboo and off limits. It's all got to be stuff you can measure from the third-person point of view. I think consciousness is something we know about from the first-person point of view. And a science of consciousness has to admit some of the observations from the first-person point of view as data, because I think they are data.
I'm not sure anybody is debating it.
Yeah.
Nobody is debating this these days. First-person accounts are data, and there's no problem. The question is, what do those data tell us, and can they lead us to a solution? And that is quite unclear.
Let's go to the gentleman right over there, in the middle there.
Hi, my question would be, let's say we can define and all agree on what consciousness is, and let's say we have all the techniques and all the science to identify what is a conscious state, what is a non-conscious state, whether a robot is conscious, whether a jellyfish is conscious. Then what do we do with that? What is the purpose? What is the application? And maybe that thinking that way could help us kind of back engineer on how to look at consciousness and what it is, and reverse engineer it.
I'll say one thing about it. And we didn't mention this, but it was on your question sheet. And I think there's an ethical obligation to understand this, and there's a humanitarian issue behind at least a lot of what neurologists want to know in that measurement. Because if somebody's conscious and they can't express themselves, or they can't communicate with their family members, and we could figure out, using a science of consciousness, a way to enhance their capacity to do that, or to give some of that back by doing something intelligent, that's an inherent good, at least from my point of view, and that's kind of one of the motivations.
Well, isn't there a profound ethical question, which you're alluding to here? I mean, someone is in a horrible car crash. The doctor, the people on the scene say, sorry, this person is brain dead now, do we pull the plug?
Oh, and I can make that problem harder and harder and harder, and it keeps getting harder. And you are stuck with your ignorance and situations where without that model, you know that you're making mistakes. I can tell you we all are still making lots of mistakes. And you try to give the best information you can, and you let the families make decisions within the range of uncertainty. And this is talk about judgments under uncertainty. This is becoming more and more uncertain as the science is evolving, not less.
So isn't the implication then that we should be much more reticent about terminating life?
Well, but the flip side of this is that you also don't want to commit people to indefinite vigils for patients who are not going to recover. And you need to give you have to give a reasonable assessment, and you have to give a average answer, because you're not working with a model. Most of what is done in consciousness science, for the reasons that we've heard today in medicine, is statistical. Somebody's in a vegetative state, they had this kind of injury, there aren't a lot of other measurements that you can do often if they're in a zone where it's not certain. Sometimes things are simple. Sometimes the brain is dead. Brain death is death. It's not a diagnosis. It doesn't have a prognosis. It's a diagnosis, it doesn't have a prognosis. The person is dead if they're brain dead. But if they're in minimally conscious state at a month after a very severe injury, things become harder. Now, you might be able to statistically estimate that their level of function might not be at X, Y, or Z, but then it's an issue of value and an issue of what human contact they're going to have with their family, and often the answer to that is completely unknown. And there's a range of what is acceptable, and there's a range of what individuals will see as a meaningful human contact with somebody they love and have known for their whole life. And this happens in Alzheimer's disease all the time, right? I mean, this is something everybody's familiar with. An elderly person who slowly started slipping down out of contact, right? If you had some way to bring them back so they could talk to their grandchildren for a year, that might be a very important thing, right? It would be. And it may not save their life, and it might not mean that they wouldn't slip out of contact at some point in the future. This is the kind of thing that, a science of consciousness will make more law-like, predictable, and allow us to talk in a more intelligent way with people about what can and can't happen and what we should do, and should we do this? Is it something you want to do? Those conversations are never going to be easy, but they could be better informed.
Let's go way back in the back row there.
Thanks for an awesome panel. It's curious to me that nobody in the panel is representing a thoroughgoing reductionist account of consciousness that, say, Daniel Dennett might have argued for in his book, Consciousness Explained Away, retitled. But there is a fundamental problem that nobody's really addressed, which is that we're using the brain to study the brain. So there's a kind of tautology here that we're sort of locked into. And I think Haldane, the biologist, once summarized it very well in that, which a quote I can only paraphrase, but basically he refused to believe that his mind was simply a biochemical process, because otherwise he would be sawing off the branch on which he sat, and would have no reason to trust his science at all. So if consciousness is purely a biochemical process, which nobody in this panel has actually represented, and there's not something emergent or transcendent in the difference between brain and mind, why should we even believe scientists and when they speculate on these issues?
Who wants to take that? The philosopher, Dave.
Well, I think it was directed at a reductionist, which I am, which I am not. But I think the brain can study the brain. Microscopes can study microscopes, and so on. There's not a rule and principle against systems directing study at them, directing the scientific inquiry at themselves. The question, I suppose, is then it's really, how do you know any of this is how do you know that? I mean, there's a basic question: how do you even know the brain is there, right? How do you know you're not in the matrix and all this? Descartes said, being produced in your mind by a Cartesian evil demon who wants to fool you into thinking that you're a scientist who's doing experiments on people's brains, and in fact, it's all a big fantasy. And I think in science, we've got to give the same kind of answer you make elsewhere in science: is you basically just have to assume that the deliverances of perception are a guide to reality, because without doing that, you can't start doing science. And I think it's the same in the science of consciousness.
There are apparent paradoxes where the best response is simply to walk away. I mean, it's not, you're not going to solve it.
When I interviewed Dan Dennett and asked him, so how big a mystery is consciousness, he said, it's not a mystery. There are just lots of puzzles.
Yeah.
The next question. Let's come up in the front row here.
So far, most of the discussion has been with people who are scientists, who quote, but there are a whole bunch of other people out there, not the least of which are great writers. To whom, in the panel, who would you consider as a writer who has made a contribution to trying to crystallize a little bit more clearly what consciousness is? There are some who come to my mind, James Joyce's Interior Monologues, and Oliver Sacks, and maybe Julian James and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. I mean, there are a great many people who are really concerned with this. Who do you like as a writer who may have contributed to your discipline?
That's a great question. Who wants to start?
I mean, you mentioned one of the ones that I would put out there, which is Jane Goodall, right? I mean, I think good writers that tell us something about consciousness are just fantastically good at doing the game of what it would be like to be a blank. And in my world, knowing what it's like to be a chimpanzee, it helps if you hang out with a lot of chimpanzees. You're not just a good writer. So I think all the time she spent trying to get inside their mind is fantastically good. And if you read some of her pieces aimed at a popular audience to try to describe what it's like to be David Greybeard or one of her favorite chimps, you get a fantastic look at that. But my read is that it's about writers being good at getting inside the heads of other individuals, and that's not necessarily a good scientific understanding of consciousness or figuring out the problem that we've been up here talking about. It's the kind of person who has a good set of System 1 intuitions about just plopping inside somebody's head and then describing back to the readers, like, what is it like to be, like that kind of thing.
I'm going to go for Proust. I'm really interested in phenomenological methods, representing one of the big questions, the challenges for the science is tools to accurately describe and represent states of consciousness, which we're not terribly good at. We need a better phenomenological method, and you look at Proust. He's a master phenomenologist, characterizing his states of consciousness in vast, gory detail. And I think that's one of the things we can look to writers to do. And the question is, can you take that and make science of it?
Other literary influences?
I mean, all those I would mention have already been mentioned. So Oliver Sacks would be the one that I'm most current with. But, and again, the issue arises, those people speak to your intuitions. I mean, they do something that feels right. So it is really quite interesting. And for me, that's the way I've thought about many philosophical questions ever since I was a child, that the psychology of our philosophical intuitions is fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. And the psychology of, why some accounts of consciousness appear appealing and others don't, as a psychological problem, is fascinating. Even if I really don't think the problem can be solved at all. But the psychology is good. Or can be good.
So I think it's a great question, and what's coming to my mind immediately is when you asked about consciousness and self, my answer is consciousness first, because I've been reading Helen Keller, who is an incredibly amazing writer. But she's in the end of her life, or a later book that she wrote called Teacher about Anne Macy Sullivan, she talks about her real feeling about who she was or what she was before Sullivan taught her language. And it's amazing because she doesn't attribute a self-identity to the conscious being that she was. She actually labels it phantom. And she describes it in detail as an entity that was just being pushed around and reacting. And usually violently, and usually with limbic drives. And she's an eloquent writer. And it's not the focus of her book. It's mostly about how Sullivan taught her and what it meant to her. But that section for me is very interesting. I've been reading it and thinking about measurements and thinking about this general issue. But that's one that maybe you won't hear.
Can we ask the narrator?
William James is one of my heroes who has been mentioned here, and I am astonished at how contemporary he still is. I mean, a book like Varieties of Religious Experience, and I have a particular interest in questions about science and religion, but he's just, I think he's still asking questions that that most people don't even talk about still. I find him stunning. Here, let's go over here in the yes.
One of the things that you guys talked about was how when people are showing emotions that they're actually conscious and also making complicated calculations. And like when I walked to work today, I was probably not aware of any of the steps that I was taking. I was doing it unconsciously, but they were very complicated calculations. So why would seeing emotions or doing things, having calculations be necessary to relate to consciousness?
Yeah. So when I mentioned the doing calculations part of our intuition that a creature is conscious, I think I meant doing calculations in a way that makes you seem like us. Because as somebody who studies animals, I can watch people's intuitions turn on and watch people wanting to attribute subjective states to animals that do things like we do. So take the ant case, right? I think one of the reasons you see the ants reacting to deaths and taking dead individuals out to a cemetery, that's kind of like what we do. And I think that instantly trips up our mechanisms to say, oh, wait, it must be like us. I think Danny's right that acting in emotional ways like we do is a special way to trip up these mechanisms. I'm not sure any of you guys have seen this, but the company IKEA had a commercial about buying new light bulbs a while back where they used a sort of Pixar-esque CGI of an old lamp that was about to get thrown out. And it had very emotional music, and the lamp was sort of hunched over, and it looked sad when the new lamp came in, and it gets tossed out in the rain, and it's standing in the rain. And you can't help, and the punchline for the IKEA salesperson comes on and says, it's just a lamp, it doesn't have feelings, buy a new one. And so IKEA. But the point is, you can't help but watch a lamp that's exhibiting these kinds of things that look like us. So my instinct is the thing that trips up our, hey, that creature has subjective experience the most is like us.
And you see a dog feeling guilty. That's a powerful intuition. There is a behavior that makes us empathize with guilt, and dogs can produce that behavior and are rewarded for it.
We're running very short of time. Let's go over to this side in the gentleman in the middle there.
Hi. I think no matter what we all believe about consciousness, somehow we all believe that we are on some level. And we all believe this so much that we all decide to take a bunch of time out of our day to come and listen to this panel. So my question is, and we obviously evolved that way. So my question is, what are the advantages of being conscious? And why are we? What did it give us?
Yeah. I think this question gets even more complicated when we start to realize that many of the decisions we make that feel the most conscious aren't necessarily the ones that are the best decisions. Yeah. Danny can speak to this more than I can, but I think the puzzle gets bigger because if you think of the stuff that you do that's not conscious, like not getting hit on the way here and those kinds of things, from a natural selection perspective, those could be the ones that are doing a lot of the hard work of staying alive and getting mates and so on.
I think we just don't have an evolutionary answer to that question right now. I think if we did, the theory of consciousness would be in much better shape. One way to put the basic question of consciousness is, why didn't evolution just produce a race of zombies? These physical systems that went around doing all this stuff without consciousness at all. It didn't. Consciousness is there. So you might think there's reasons to think that it, in fact, has some function, but every time someone proposes a function, it looks like, boy, you can do all that in principle without consciousness.
Yeah.
Let's, right up near the front here, the woman, second row.
Thank you. Is consciousness the supreme biological function? You seem to even suggest that it was, at some point, akin to life. Or is it just that we've all evolved the ability to think about it, so we're sitting around talking about it as though it is?
I work on consciousness, so of course I'm going to say it's the supreme biological function.
I mean, it's pretty cool. If I had to trade my subjective experience with a jellyfish, I'm not sure I'd take the wager, so.
I have a question for each of you before we wrap up here. If you could answer one question about consciousness, sort of the big question that preoccupies you, if there is one, what would it be? What's the question you most want answered? Dave, let me start with you.
I just want to understand it, so I guess the question is, explain consciousness. What will be an explanation of consciousness? What will a theory of consciousness look like? And maybe that's cheating, because that question is so big, it's going to encompass answers to all the others. But hey, we're philosophers. We're
the right strategy.
And I want to have his answers. Really. I mean, I think that's genuine progress being made. That, and this is science, and these are facts, and they're important facts, and they work on our intuitions, and they make for a better world, and we need more of this, I think.
Thank you. Well, I would say I think my answer is the same, but it's it would be that if we could have a mechanistic account of how subjective experience arises in the brain, that would probably answer, as David said, lots and lots of questions, and then we could work with that model. And then, assuming that's possible, I'd like to assume it is.
Laurie?
Since I'm not sure it's totally possible, I'm going to go with something else, which is I would like us to have a full account of all of our intuitions about what is conscious, what's not conscious, and how all of that works at an information processing level. I feel like that's going to do a big job of making the world a better place, our decisions a better place, and so on. And based on what we know about cognitive science and the methods we have that work pretty well, that's something that might be more likely to happen in our lifetime.
Oh yeah, I mean this is a feasible program.
Right.
I mean to understand our intuitions, because they're pretty simple. They're not internally coherent. I mean, that's why we can't use that as a basis for a science. But they do explain a lot about empathy. And so if we understood that, there is a lot of social emotion that we would be understanding at the same time.
We could go on, but we are out of time. Thank you so much, David Chalmers, Daniel Kahneman, Laurie Santos, and Nicholas Schiff.